Welcome to episode 17. You are trapped in history with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. I have been a high school history teacher for 15 years. I have taught world history and U.S. history. Additionally, I have taught AP European history for the last 5 years, and I am entering my 6th year now. The purpose of this podcast is meant to support history teachers and students, as well as anybody who is purely interested in history. This episode is entitled Renaissance Ideas and Their Legacy. Before we dive further into this particular episode, I just wanted to kind of give my reasoning for it. Over the last week and a half or so, my family and I have been in a little bit of a health crisis. My mother had a pretty strong case of pneumonia and was in the hospital. And I had missed some school for about 5 days, and I was in the hospital on some of those days with her. Luckily, her situation greatly improved. She had just been transferred back to her home hospital in Tell City, Indiana yesterday, and she's now on rehab and occupational therapy. But it was a very scary situation, and now I'm just kind of feel like I'm in a fog. I don't know if any of you that have ever taught before have been teaching. When you miss a significant amount of time right in the middle of what school's going on, when you first come back, you kind of feel like you're teaching anew again. You're kind of teaching in like a blur. So I told my students in AP that, unfortunately, we're going to have to do a couple of days of like a lecture storytelling style of class, which I think some of them liked because it gave them a break from some of the paperwork side for a while. But I also told them that I would go ahead and record an episode introducing a lot of the main ideas of the Renaissance, and specifically the Italian Renaissance, and then a separate episode on the Northern Renaissance. And I wanted to keep these episodes relatively short, not as long as whenever I interview someone from before. So this is what's kind of sparked me to go ahead and do this episode now. I also realized some of my teacher friends that are starting their school year is either starting this last week or recently started. So maybe you are teaching Unit 1 or you're about to or in the middle of it. Either way, I hope that this episode provides you some value, even if you're just interested in history and you're not teaching at all. So before we dive into the Italian Renaissance part, let me give you a little bit of the background. So just so you know, the Renaissance wasn't just a period of artistic brilliance. It was also a time of foundations of modern thought were built. Today, we will explore these revolutionary ideas and how they shaped the world. But I want to go ahead and jump into that newer segment that we started a few episodes back. I wanted to provide a quote of the week and a document or source of the week whenever we can get an opportunity, because as a new teacher or even as an experienced one, it's good to get some other references, and you might be able to hear something that you can use in class, or if you're a student, you might be able to hear something that might help give you better context and an overall understanding of the unit. It doesn't hurt to have a lot of different sources. So our quote of the week, it's going to be a very short one. This quote comes from a man named Protagoras. He is an ancient Greek philosopher, and a lot of his ideas were popularized throughout the Renaissance through a philosophy called Humanism, which we're going to be touching base on tonight. Also, the context or significance of this quote I'll discuss as soon as I do the quote. So the short quote this week says, man is the measure of all things. And I think that this is a revolutionary quote in itself, or at least a rebirth of an old way of thinking, because you have to think of the time period before the Renaissance. You have that Middle Ages period where a lot of intellectual thought was predicated and steered towards the divine and religious works. So to say that man is the measure of all things, I think the two words that stand out to me there the most is the all things part. Because I don't know if you would have heard that kind of language used academically during the Middle Ages before the Renaissance, but we obviously hear that in ancient Greece. And that right there, for the students and teachers that are first starting, just that short quote is a great way to say, hey, here's what I mean about how different it can be, is that, a quote like this basically implies that, we measure our own success. We can reach the epitome or the pinnacle of what it means to not just be a man, but to be an advanced human. And I always teach this as whenever students see a man with a capital M, think of like humanity in general. And I know that back then it's predominantly going to be geared to men, but I would think of humanity in general, because you remember we have to make all of our student voices matter for a meaningful reason. And many of us that teach AP, we have a large number of female students compared to male students in the class. And it's very important to reiterate that, hey, this is not just voices of old white men. These philosophies and these quotes can resonate across the board to all of humanity. Now, to provide a little bit of context and significance to that last quote, to give another better idea and another layer to understanding the Renaissance and humanism, just think about, even though this quote comes from ancient Greece, like Protagoras is not alive during the Italian Renaissance, but this quote's from ancient Greece, and it says, Renaissance humanists revived such classical ideas. And that's a word that you're going to see or use often throughout the unit. Is the Renaissance itself is this rebirth of these older classical ideas. And many times you'll see a word called antiquity used instead of the word classical. This quote reflects the humanist focus on human potential and the belief that individuals, rather than divine forces, are central to understanding the world. And that divine forces philosophy might have been something that might have been more commonly seen, especially academically, in the era before the Renaissance. So in that era of the fall of Rome to the birth of the Renaissance, there you might see that. As far as reflection goes, I think this quote challenges us to think about the Renaissance as a rebirth, not just of art, because I know it's easy to get kind of down the slippery slope of the art, and the art is extremely meaningful and valuable. And for visual learners, it's great on helping them understand some of these values and attributes that make this era so different. But it's the idea that puts human beings at the center of inquiry. And I know for many of our students, or at least for some of them, the word inquiry is a little bit confusing for them. They're not used to seeing that word as much. But basically, it's a questioning attitude. It kind of encourages people in society to question the world more. Like, why are we here? Who am I? Reading more about poetry or love or death or fear. It's not just always reading about divine beings. And even in that visual art, we see the prop up of beings in like the religious stories, but they're like the more human characteristics of them, like David, for example. So while we're going through this, I want you to consider, whether you're a teacher or you're a student, how did this shift influence both the individual and collective achievements? Because I know it's really easy to kind of use those Renaissance artists for those achievement things on there too. And you could use Machiavelli with the Prince, and using Petrarch. We're going to discuss him tonight, or Erasmus. There's lots of famous names that you could use. And AP gives you a good list of names that you can reflect on for different, I guess you can say, different eras or different sections or types of changes during the Renaissance. And you don't have to cover all of those. We're meant to kind of pick which ones we get. So I just want to let you know before we go any further, many of you might be a much better teacher than I am. And you might find that I miss some topics or miss some valuable people that could be on there. And I completely understand that. I'm just kind of going with what I focus on to get my students to understand these themes that are on there. If you have other ways to teach this, then I would love to know that. I would love to have you on the podcast episode. We can team teach together and go through those. And you can really give me a lot of insight too that I could use in my classroom. So let's transition over to the document of the week. Also a pretty short one. So in the show notes, I'm going to put the quote that I'm going to use for the document, but I'm also going to put another section from this particular letter that we're going to use. So one of our focus people tonight on the podcast is going to be a man named Petrarch, or Petrarca. He is going to write a document that a lot of AP history teachers will reference from time to time. And it's a document called the Letter to Posterity. And a lot of our students may not really know what posterity means. An easier way to address it would be future. They tell students, like, it's like saying this man is writing a letter to the future of humanity, or his idealistic insight on that as he's going. The point of view for Petrarch, he is a Renaissance humanist, specifically an Italian humanist, and he was the one that brought a lot of these classical ideas back to the Italian city-states and helped to really kickstart that. So even though Petrarch's writings are before that 1450 starting point, people like him and Dante are giving a lot of these new ideas and ways of writing inspiration. So we do see the Renaissance really take off later on. So the document reference I'm going to use is more of a quote this time. So I'm going to put the quote and a much larger section of the document in there because I think you can use either one. I use both in class, but I won't read the longer one to you. You can look at the show notes to see that. So the source line says, an excerpt from Petrarch's, he's a Renaissance Italian humanist. It is called the Letter to Posterity, and it's dated in 1372. And he famously says, I am one who was born to love liberty and truth. I do not envy the past, but I aspire to revive the spirit of antiquity. And there's that A word again. So having students like replace that antiquity word with classics or classical, right there he makes it very clear what his motive is. His goal is to revive how the ancient Greeks used to study and write about, and then make that more available to the commoners. And we, in our next episode, when we touch base on the printing press, think about how much that could resonate through even commoners in a city that become more literate later whenever he has ideas like this. Now, the longer passage from him is pretty interesting. It breaks down a little bit more about what he enjoys doing on his own. And you're going to notice that it's very secular. Like in his quote and in his paragraph, he doesn't touch base on religion much. He does mention the words sacred literature at one point or another, but he doesn't dwell on the divine. And that's one of those common differences, whether you're reading Baldassar, Castiglione, or somebody else that you're using as a reference in class, they're not going to see those overly used divine or religious references. And that's another sign, along with the date window, that this is a Renaissance writing. So as far as the background of that, Petrarch reflects on his life and his values, his importance of intellectual pursuits. So he's trying to motivate others to pursue ambitiously intellectual opportunities. And this is a key example of Renaissance humanism. And this is one of the reasons why he is considered very important to remember this. He's considered the father of humanism. And his works really emphasize the study of classical texts and the development of an individual identity. It's not going to be as focused on that group identity that we might have seen more common in the Middle Ages era of Europe. Now, I do want you to understand about daily life too. If you were a commoner, a peasant, or a serf living on the fringes of the cities, on the rural areas, you probably don't realize there's a Renaissance happening much. I mean, for the most part, your life is the same as it was during the Middle Ages. You're mainly based around agriculture and other merchant kind of work. But if you were in the cities, you were probably able to see a little bit more of this. But especially if you were in the merchant class, if you're a wealthy person, a lot of the wealthy families like the Medici family in Florence is commissioning a lot of this new art and ideas to be pushed forward. So I like Petrarch because, teenagers like ours, they want their voices heard. They want their voices to matter. And I think he's a great person that says, hey, be ambitious in your life. I mean, and it's not to say that you can't be religious either. I mean, most humanists I would think are agnostic or atheists, but I think you can be a religious individual and still be a humanist. And it's just also being able to praise other qualities of us as a human individual and not just as a creation of God. And it's another reason why one of the first paintings we do every year is the creation of Adam, the middle of the Sistine Chapel Michelangelo painting. We break down what that's supposed to mean, and even like the size comparison of God to Adam and the realism that's on there, what all that philosophically means between the lines. So also, as a teacher, you could have, I could use this as a discussion with my class about Petrarch's emphasis on personal liberty and intellectual freedom, laid the foundation for Renaissance thinking, and encouraged the revival of classical ideas. So kind of view him more as the guy that really sparks that. Whereas in the next episode, when we move to the Northern Renaissance, on that, after I do my interview this week, we're going to touch base on a man named Erasmus, who comes from a Christian humanist perspective. So let's go into our main segment of the night here and break down our ideas for the podcast here. So in general, we're going to break down the Italian Renaissance, the isms, as we call them, the humanism, individualism, and secularism. I personally also see that rationalism has a place in here, although many of us think that that's not until Unit 4 with Descartes that we really hit on that. But we do see some people encouraging and even using the language of rationalism. So if you wanted to use all four of those as themes for your unit, then by all means do that. So whenever I was trained the first year under Larry Treadwell to teach this class, he told us that he often uses, a handful of themes to introduce every chapter. And I always tell my students that if you understand these themes, no matter the dates or the individual names, you're going to have a very good base understanding of the unit, and you have a better chance of performing well in your writing and on multiple choice tests and short answers, all those kind of things. So let's go first off in the Italian Renaissance. And as we said earlier, the Italian Renaissance is a cultural movement, and it began in the 14th century, and it's reviving classical ideas, and it transforms areas of art and science and society. So when you're teaching this or you're learning it, think of the time periods more like a wedding cake instead of like a linear timeline of A, B to C. Because as you know, Unit 1 and 2 are overlapping each other on the same time. But when you get to Unit 4 and you bring up Copernicus, you realize, hey, this guy is during the Renaissance. This guy is bringing up the heliocentric theory in that time period. So you can't teach Copernicus without mentioning humanism, without mentioning the Renaissance, because, it'd be ignorant to not assume that the Renaissance didn't affect his way of thinking and did not encourage his questioning attitude to begin with whenever he questions the geocentric theory of the universe. So a key example for Italian Renaissance is the birthplace geographically of the Renaissance, which is Florence, Italy. This was known as a hub of activity for the Renaissance, and you had patrons there. And a patron would be someone that commissions art, pays for it, supports it, like the famous banking family in Florence called the Medici or Medici family. They supported famous artists like Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man, Michelangelo. You can bring any of the other Ninja Turtles in here as well too, like your Raphael, your Donatello. And you have other artists as well that you could bring up. So it's also important to try to make connections to our modern era too, because I love teaching the Renaissance every year because it's a great introduction into the way that they should think the rest of the year. Because the Renaissance sets a stage for the modern era by focusing on human experience and that rational thought. And that's something that in my teaching style that's predicated around of dialogue, discussion, debate on there. I'm trying to get the students to be very comfortable with that early. And AP students tend to be by majority very comfortable doing that. Whereas in my general education world history classes, it takes them a little bit longer sometimes to kind of get into that groove and momentum. So let's move on to what Petrarch was known as the father of. So one of your main topics, and I would recommend bringing this up, finding ways of spiraling this in to as much content as you can throughout the year. Don't just teach this topic and then never bring it up again the rest of the year. But the topic is the main one of the unit, which is humanism. And humanism is an emphasis on the study of classical text. It's also valuing the human individual experience and the potential of that individual achievement. And that's why a lot of people focus on Da Vinci often, because Da Vinci he wasn't just good, he was masterful at so many aspects, whether it be math or engineering or art. And it's like, here's a model human being, strive for this. So, try to reach the best potential you can. And again, this might be something that might be better to bring up the next episode, but I'll bring it up here because I think it goes well with humanism. Some history teachers will often use a resource or a document from Erasmus that's entitled The Praise of Folly. And this is a work that it critiques societal and religious corruption while also reflecting those humanist values like education and critical thinking. You wouldn't have seen that focus in writing on individual education and being able to critically and rationally think as something that would have been common before the Italian Renaissance, before the late 1300s or 1450, something like that. And a topic that goes hand in hand with humanism is your other ism, your other theme of the unit, individualism. Individualism is during the Renaissance, and it celebrates that personal achievement, self-expression. This is why it's so fun, especially with visual learners, to break down art and be able to tie that into how does this visually and symbolically represent these themes, these ideas of the Renaissance. A great one to use, and I often use this in class, I use it on the test, is Michelangelo's version of David. And like Larry Treadwell had showed me, I'll often put Michelangelo's David right side by Donatello's David. If you've never seen Donatello's David, you need to Google that, look it up, consider using it in your class. It's fascinating because they're both about the same person. They're both about in this heroic underdog story of David and Goliath, and but they both symbolize different aspects of the Renaissance and individual expression that's on there. Because Donatello's version of David, to me, it really looks more like maybe somebody the age of a shepherd boy like David would have been. It's more of a thin pose, but it does have a feminine pose and longer hair. And maybe that was a way for Donatello to express his own personal feelings and beliefs in what he thought David should be depicted as. And David's foot's on top of Goliath's head. Whereas Michelangelo's David, it's a bigger statue. It's also very, very muscular. And that's a very common theme that we saw in Mannerist paintings and not naturalist style, but it's that style where they're really trying to show the accuracy of the human body and express that talent that's on there. But Michelangelo's David, it's an idealistic version of this teenage shepherd boy that defeated Goliath. I mean, because he looks like a guy that spends hours in the gym and drinks a lot of protein and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a very like romanticized kind of version of David. Now, maybe I should use the word romanticized because I know that's a romanticism element we get into art later on in the year. But man, the statue of David for Donatello and Michelangelo is so good because Michelangelo's version it's showcasing individual heroism and mastery, highlighting the emphasis on human potential. And what I like about it is that even though David's in the Bible and it's a divine kind of character, you can't overlook the fact that David is a human being, though. And this is showing that something that's heroic about him and placing him up on a pedestal. It's not just a depiction of God or Jesus for that kind of thing. So this is another sign that, hey, this is a Renaissance art. One of the last major isms that teachers hit on is a topic called secularism. And secularism, by definition, just means non-religious. And the way it was used in the Renaissance, it basically reflects a broader interest in human experience beyond the divine. So it's one of those motivational factors that affects the way people are writing. Like Machiavelli, whenever we hit on him at the beginning of the next episode, he's basically, actually we're going to hit him on a little bit tonight too. But he's writing about things that about politics and religious morality and how to rule and how to obtain power and maintain power. He's not discussing how a king or queen should be sharing power with God. He's not touching base hardcore on religious themes. So he's popular in your AP work for creating secular models for the way people should be in politics. And we could use Machiavelli as a template later as you're going forward into the future. So a great example to use in class would be Machiavelli's The Prince. It's not a long book at all, and sometimes I let students borrow it. But it focuses on political power and leadership without the use of religious morality. And even though that we see going forward, a lot of kings and queens in Unit 3 will be using that absolutism, that divine right of kings philosophy. So it doesn't hurt for a king to claim, God meant for me to be your king, or the queen to say that, and to be able to use that to reinforce their goal of centralizing more power onto them. But that's not Machiavelli's goal here. And I know Machiavelli's also writing to the Medici family, trying to earn his good graces back. So there's different motives for why Machiavelli would be trying to write this book in a personal way. But that's the three isms. I still think that you could make an argument that rationalism deserves to be one of those isms as well. But I'll skip over that for now. But I would be interested to see what one of you would think on how we could effectively spiral in rationalism as one of those themes as well. So our last individual of the night, we're going to focus kind of where we started at on the podcast with a man named Petrarch. And like I said earlier, he is known as the father of humanism. He's going to be promoting bringing back classical literature and philosophy again. This is an individual I tell my students that he doesn't really like his own generation. And I always ask students, do you ever get frustrated with your own age group? And not to say there's not great qualities with it, but Petrarch can empathize with that because he didn't really feel like the era that he lived in was ideal. He kind of wished that he was alive in that classical antiquity period. And he would write letters to dead men. He would write letters to Cicero and other people from ancient Greeks or ancient Romans because he aspired to be that way. He also wrote poetry, some poetry about, Laura, his girlfriend that had died in the Black Death. A lot his poetry could touch base like Shakespeare on things like tragedy and love. So there's those elements again that you wouldn't have normally seen before Dante and before Petrarch, before the Renaissance. But if you wanted to use another example in class from Petrarch's specific writings, I might mess up the pronunciation here. I think it's Canzoniere, and the way you pronounce it, I might have to correct that and amend that later. But he basically has a collection of poems that reflect love and human emotion. And remember, emotion is a great quality of Renaissance art because you see realism and sometimes mysticism and mannerism, perspective and proportion, geometric measurements being used in the artwork. But you also see emotion. And I told my students yesterday that the Mona Lisa is a great example of this too, because there's a lot of debate over who Mona Lisa is. I mean, we do know that she's not a wealthy monarch. She's not a religious figure. So here's a portrait of somebody that could just be a commoner. It could be a basic one. It could be a self-portrait or something like that. So there it is again. It's that more of an unusual style that you wouldn't have seen before that. But she shows emotion in the painting, and I think it's another good one to use as a visual for class. So Petrarch's approach to scholarship and writing and self-reflection was revolutionary, and it inspired future Renaissance thinkers like Dante and Boccaccio to really hit on that. So that finishes our main themes tonight. The main goal here is to really get a great overview. I wanted it to be about a half-hour podcast to touch base really on Italian Renaissance. And then I'm going to address the Northern Renaissance, the printing press, and kind of wrap all the Renaissance up into a 2-episode sort of series. So that'll be probably episode 19 or 20 whenever I get a chance to do that. But I want to end the episode, whether you're a student or a teacher, and you're like me and you like to do discussions, I want to end on at least a couple of philosophical questions that you could use as a class-wide discussion. You can use in a debate or anything like that. So I want to leave you with a couple of questions tonight. So if you're driving to work, if you're on the bus going to school or something like that, you're in the middle of this unit and you're trying to push yourself to have a better, deeper understanding on these topics. Because if you're a student, you need to be able to write about these and be able to write abstractly and make your writings deeper, more than just that surface level on there. So the more content you know, obviously, the better. But definitely at least have a grasp of the main individuals and the main themes of the unit. So the first question of the 2 questions I'll leave you with, the first one is worded as, can the emphasis on the individual achievement during the Renaissance be seen as the beginning of the modern obsession with personal success? And you can ask a follow-up of, how does this focus shape our society today? What a great question for students to ruminate on, or for you to do as a teacher. Many of us use our cell phones. We rely on social media, and I don't care if it's Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram, whatever it is that you're using to communicate with other people on. It's all about sometimes clicks and likes and shares. And man, what a perfect segue into that. Do you think the encouragement of individual achievement from back in the 14 and 1500s, do you think that also could have affected us now? Would we be where we were now if it wasn't for those encouragements later on? So as we all know, individualism can be really good, and it can also be toxic at times too. I would like to think it's mostly good, but I think there's also a significant value of being part of a group, a shared identity, things like that. So when you're reflecting on this, consider whether the Renaissance celebration of the individual aligns with, or does it challenge modern values? So obviously the kids know a lot of the modern values because they're freaking living it. And when I do the discussions and debates with my classes, man, I love to be right there with them. I play the devil's advocate. I encourage them to go after me within those discussions. And I intend on using this exact question here in a week or so whenever we finish Unit 1. So to wrap up the podcast tonight, the last question I'll leave you with that you could ask on a written assignment or discussion could be this one. Does the rise of secularism during the Renaissance suggest that faith and reason are incompatible, or can they coexist? How has this debate evolved in the centuries since? Now, that second part of the question might be hard for them since they haven't really covered those centuries yet on there. But I do think, I live in basically the Bible Belt. I'm interested because I think a lot of the students see a lot of value in individualism and the ideas of humanism, but many of them come from a religious background as well. So it's really cool to see, okay, so can they be together? Because one could easily argue that they can coexist, or do you believe that they butt heads with each other, they conflict with each other? So whenever you're the teacher and you're thinking about using this, or you're trying to teach this unit, or you're the student and you're trying to get a deeper understanding, think about the relationship between religion and rational thought, both during the Renaissance and in the present day, and in the way that society uses it. And also not just to think of one group of people, but think of all the classes. How do the peasants or how do the commoners address these things? How do middle class people have merchant class and royalty and clergy members? Like, this affects everybody across the board. So I hope that you found value in this episode. I was trying to tie the main themes of the Italian Renaissance and the Renaissance in general, at least give you one individual to follow, give you a couple of quotes or sources to use for you as the teacher or the student. But other than that, I really hope that you all have a great day. I hope you have a great night, great rest of the week. As always, be contagious.